everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the second session of our series on assisted dying around the world, or current issues in assisted dying, or something like that. Um, the first one was on Switzerland. Some of you have seen that, I hope, and if not, it's on our website, Hemlock Society, sandiego.org, and all of them will be, including today's, of course. These are free. They're open to the public. We would like everybody in the world to see them so people understand what the Right to Die movement is, how it differs from country to country, what the struggles have been, why it's taking so long for everybody to have a law permitting them to have a peaceful death, and to meet some of the important players in the Right to Die movement. Some of us are getting old, so we need to have some recognition about how this all started and who were the players. Our next meeting will be July 22nd, every 2 weeks. And we'll talk about assisted dying in the United States. And we'll include Dr. Kevorkian, Derek Humphrey, Final Exit Network, and of course, the current laws based on the Oregon model. I'm Faye Gersh. I'm the founder of the Hemlock Society of San Diego. And this is Ken Watson on the board, and Pat Fisher, who's helping us, who was our first executive assistant. And we hope with this very complicated trans-Pacific technology that we get this all brought to you without too many problems. We have 3 interviews on this broadcast from starting from 1995, the people that were involved at that time. And here we come 22 years later to a country that has now 2/3 of the population having access to the law. And you'll meet the people we're interviewing. Australia is a good country to talk about. First of all, they speak English, more or less. And it was the first country to have a right to die law, and the first country to have somebody die under it with actually euthanasia. It was modeled after the Oregon law, but after each of the 4 states passed the law has changed and been modified to the good, as you'll see, I think. With us today, we have interviews with the only courageous politician I know, and that is Marshall Perrin Hilpy Lest, and Judy Dent, the spouse of the first man who died in the world, and Dr. Yeah. Anyway, yes, so you'll see. And we'll review the current status of the laws in California. And full disclosure, my daughter, who's popped up in the picture here, Kamala Allister, lives in Queensland, and she's been there a number of years, so I do have some familiar with the country. It's fairly easy to understand, as we'll see. And I mention frequently that a lot of these people that I know because of the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. And that's an organization of Right to Die societies around the world that meets every 2 years, not this year because of COVID, but next year in Canada. And we get to know each other, which is really wonderful. So you can become a sponsor of the World Federation. Go to their website, World Federation of Right to Die Societies. That's not what it is exactly, and then you can attend the meetings, and you become a non-voting member, essentially. Since 1996, we've met twice in Melbourne, Australia. And a lot of the players that we are interviewing today were there, of course. They're all there. I became president of the Hemlock Society, National Hemlock Society in 1996, and that was quite a historic year. Besides the fact that Bob Dent was the first person in the world to die under a law that year, there were serious challenges to the law in the United States that year, which were very helpful. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks, but unfortunately were rescinded by the United States Supreme Court. And the Oregon law passed in 1997. So A lot of things happen along the way, and it's important to remember our history. Uh, so let's start. Ken, shall we? Okay. The kangaroos died peacefully, I think, without our help. Next. So, in order to understand what goes on in Australia, you have to understand the geography. There are 6 states and 10 territories. We're not going to be talking about all the territories, only 2 of them that are within the boundaries of the country. The first state that passed a law, as I said before, was the Northern Territory. I don't think you can see my pointer, but that is the big, it's not a state, it's a territory that's right in the middle, on top there, and the capital is Darwin. Darwin's a lovely city. I highly recommend it. Very nice and warm there right now, I think. No, I don't know. Anyway, that was the first place where anybody died under law in 1996. The law was rescinded in 1997, as we'll talk about later. And so Northern Territory will be on the list to have a law again. The second state, the first state that passed a law was Victoria. Victoria is down here, lower bottom of Australia. And again, that was Dr. Rodney Syme, who had a lot to do with that law, and we'll be hearing from him. The second state was Western Australia, obviously in the west of Australia. The capital is Perth. And both of those laws are now in effect, Victoria and Western Australia. The third state was Tasmania, down here, this island, triangular shaped. Hobart is the capital, charming place. And the fourth state was South Australia, which is here under the Northern Territory. So 2 more to go, Queensland, where my daughter lives, and New South Wales, where Sydney is, and the most populous state. The 2 territories are Australian Capital Territory here, right under New South Wales, and of course the Northern Territory. Population of Australia is 26 million, which is of course considerably less than what we have in the United States. Next. So to summarize, in 1996, the Northern Territory, thanks to Marshall Perrin, as the chief minister, passed a law called the Rights to the Terminally Ill Act. The first person to die under the law was Bob Dent, a Territorian who had very serious and metastasized prostate cancer. The doctor who helped him and 3 other people was Dr. Philip Nitschke. We're going to be talking about him in later sessions, so we're not going to be talking about him so much today, although he's certainly very prominent in Australian right to die history. And then in 1997, ROTI was rescinded by the federal parliament thanks to Kevin Andrews, who was essentially the leader of the Catholic delegation in the federal parliament in Canberra. 22 years later, the first law in the state was passed in Victoria, then Western Australia, then Tasmania, then South Australia. So that is the status of the situation now. Next. This is Philip Nitschke on the left. Many of you are familiar with him. He's not exactly an invisible figure in the world, very active in the world effort to have for people to have a peaceful death. This is Judy Dent, from whom you'll be hearing in a minute, the wife of Bob Dent, the first man who died under the law. Next. This is Marshall Perrin, from whom you'll be hearing at the end, who was the chief minister, devised all by himself a bill, eventually called the Rights to the Terminally Ill Bill, then Rights to the Terminally Ill Act. He introduced that in 1995, and you'll hear from him how that happened, because that is a very unusual thing to happen. He retired from politics before the vote, so that people in his party could vote their conscience, and essentially retired from politics after a 21-year stint in the Northern Territory Parliament. Bob Dent died in 1996. 3 others died subsequently with Lubnitsky's help until the law was rescinded by the federal parliament in 1997 after having existed only for 9 months. The basis for the rescinding of the law was that Northern Territory was not a state. And they're going to challenge that in the next upcoming debate here. Next. So Marshall said this, which I think is a good guidepost for all of us in the Right to Die movement. There is no rational argument for insisting that a person continue to endure pain, indignity, and suffering when they would prefer to die. Next. Okay, now we're going to hear from Judy Dent after we get that picture off the screen. Hello. So here we go. So I would like to introduce to you Judy Dent. Judy is a rather historical figure in Australia, maybe in the world, because her husband, Bob Dent, was the first person to die with euthanasia under a law. That was a law, the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act, that first passed in 1995. Bob Dent died in 1996 with Judy at his side. The doctor was Philip Nitschke, about whom we'll talk about later. Not today, but we'll talk about some of the historic figures that were involved in that. But let's start with Judy, because I just always wondered, how did that feel for you to be such a historic figure and your husband dying at the same time?
I didn't even consider the historical aspect of it. I was just concerned that Bob got what he wanted. I mean, we never even discussed it. He simply said to me, I think I'd like to use this roti bit. I said, okay, ask Philip what we have to do. Because once Bob made up his mind to do something, he was going to do it, whether I liked it or not liked it. And why would I object? He was dying anyway.
He had prostate cancer, is that, if I recall?
Yes, and it had spread. His bones were all ready to crumble.
Oh my gosh. He was a Buddhist. Again, if I recall, this was sort of 1996, I think, when I first became aware of all this. Bob was a Buddhist. He had built himself a stupa.
Now, can we dispel that urban myth right then and there? He built a stupa at the Buddhist Society's grounds. He did not build it for himself.
Thank you.
He built it for the Buddhist community who had taken him in. He said, I didn't really like that course.
The Dalai Lama was visiting Canberra when it was announced that Bob Dent had used the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. A friend from Darwin was in Canberra too and attended a media conference where a reporter asked the Dalai Lama if suicide was a sin. He replied, yes, but if you are old and sick and already dying, it is a very tiny sin.
I really liked that course and meditated with the monk at the Buddhist Center.
The Rights of the Terminally Ill Act was a complicated law, and one of the provisions was that the patient have a psychiatric interview, but no psychiatrist in the Northern Territory were willing to provide that interview. So Philip found a psychiatrist in New South Wales, in Sydney, who did agree to do it, and that's how Bob Dent died. What we found out later was that psychiatrist was a Buddhist, and that's... Judy, you're still involved in the movement, aren't you?
I am, primarily because nobody else will do it. I've been president of the Northern Territory Voluntary Euthanasia Society since October 1996.
The ROTI, Right of the Terminally Ill Act, was passed in 1995, went into effect in 96 when Bob died, and then was rescinded in 1997.
Yes.
And then we didn't have another law until 2007. No, that's not right. 2017, when the state of Victoria passed the first law. So that's a lot of time elapsed from the first law to the second law.
Yes, but people were trying all the way through.
Right.
Just because it took until 2017 before one got passed. For example, South Australia, who have now passed a law, that was the 17th attempt.
Oh my gosh.
So they were trying before we were.
Well,
We got
you
ours
and
through
they
free.
and all of us have to be commended for our tremendous persistence and perseverance in this
Exactly.
cause. Yeah. And I just wondered what the ROTI was a complicated law, but it did permit a lethal injection for Bob to have.
Yes.
And I just wondered what you think of these new laws that were passed in now these 4 states in Australia, 2 more to go. What do you think about those laws?
ROTI was complicated enough,
Yes.
but the new ones are worse. I think I haven't read the whole thing, but I believe the Victorian law is 168 pages long and includes the requirement that the doctor must not initiate the conversation.
Right. And I don't think there's any lethal injection in any of those laws. I have to look them up again, but if I'm not mistaken.
I think
Yeah,
there
mistaken.
can be an exception if someone
That's
has no ability to swallow, but the usual
Right.
format is swallow.
So after Bob died, 3 more people died under the law, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And then it was rescinded by, I guess, I would say the Catholic bloc in Canberra, but whatever. Do you think there's any chance the so I have to explain that Judy lives in the Northern Territory, which is not one of the 6 states. It's one of the 10 territories in Australia. 3 of them, or really 2 of them, are within the limits of Australia, the Northern Territory and the ACT. What's that stand for?
Australian Capital Territory,
Thank you. So those 2 territories.
Canberra.
What do you think the chances are of getting those law changed in those territories?
Well, your 10 territories is a bit of a misnomer because
Right.
2 territories, the NT and the ACT, are self-governing. The rest of the territories belong to the closest state. So they aren't under this cloud that ACT and NT are under.
So
If I believe the health minister, federal health minister, Greg Hunt, who said, I don't care if every state passes it, the territories never will. However, the Australian Capital Territory, Dying with Dignity group, is invoking human rights. They've got solicitors working on some claim. The Northern Territory Council on the Aging has instigated a petition which now has the support of every state council on the aging. We're going to bombard the government, particularly since both Queensland and New South Wales are now, Queensland's further ahead than New South Wales, but they both are putting forth bills.
So that means for our audience that will be, when all 6 states pass it, that will be essentially all of Australia except for the territories.
Yes. The 500,000 of us who live in the territories will be discriminated against because of our postal code.
Right. Well, there's another thing, though, unique about the Northern Territory, and that is the population of Aboriginals there. And I just wondered how that has always fared with the Aboriginal population.
Well, as I explained to the Senate inquiry in January 1997 that came up here to see why they should get rid of our law, it was not a seatbelt law. If you chose to ignore it, you could do so. And there were all these stories that merely having the law prevented the Aboriginals from coming to the hospital in case they got a bad needle. That was not so. When the figures came out, there were just as many presentations to the hospital as there had been before the law. The law's existence did not affect that at all.
So, do you think the Aboriginal population is generally not opposed to the law?
Nobody's asked the Aboriginal population specifically. We get comments from leaders of various groups, but I don't know that anybody has asked individuals. And as you remarked, the Catholic Church is against it, but nobody has asked individual Catholics. After Bob died, I received a number of sympathy cards addressed simply to the widow of Bob Dent, Darwin. So I give Australia Post top marks for delivering them all straight to my mailbox. And quite a few of them had on the lines of, I am a Catholic, but I don't believe in what my church is doing. I think we should be allowed to have this law. And that was 25 years ago. So it's probably even more, a higher percentage now.
It is, I'm sure it is. And I'm wondering, in that case, was Australia, of the 4 states anyway so far, rather timid about the law that they enacted, considering the groundswell of support there was for that, for these laws?
Yes. 80% of Australians polled want such a law.
Yeah, so it very much resembles the Oregon model, which is not working very well in the United States. I think it's too restrictive. And I think the Oregon people were consulted about your law, which is how it sort of grew out of that model. But it's still better than the one we have, I think, in some of the states, if I'm not mistaken, which I could be. I wanted to ask you about Philip. Dr. Philip Nitschke was the doctor that helped Bob die and also helped the other 3 people die. No other doctor, as I remember, in the territory would do it.
Correct.
And when the law was rescinded, Philip ran for Parliament. And
against Kevin Andrews,
yes,
whose name was on the bill that rescinded our law.
And Kevin Andrews has been the nemesis of this law for forever.
Yes, he has now been deselected, i.e. he will not be running at the next federal election.
Oh, so sorry to hear that.
So are we.
I know you are, yes. And Philip did his best to defeat Kevin Andrews, but didn't quite. So Philip now lives in the Netherlands. And so are you on good terms? I know a lot of people were sort of left in the lurch by Philip and didn't agree with him in Australia.
Yes, he did upset some other people. I think it was either the first or second attempt in South Australia. As soon as the the word went out that there was going to be a bill, he rushed to South Australia and opened up a euthanasia clinic.
Oh, that must not have
Which,
gone over very well.
yes, lead balloon comes to mind.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. I remember that Mary Gowner and Francis Coombs were sort of opposed to that kind of idea.
Yes. And Francis Coombs is still with South Australian, who they've now changed their name to Voluntary Assisted Dying SA.
But yeah, I want to say something about that. We talked last time, two weeks ago, about the bill and the laws in Switzerland, and they call it assisted suicide. But in Australia, you call it VAD, voluntary assisted dying. It's interesting. I think it's
because they want it not to be thought of as suicide.
Mhm.
Because assisting suicide is a crime
Right.
still on the books. They have finally made attempting suicide not a crime, but assisting suicide is a crime. So they prefer suicide not to appear. Also, insurance policies don't pay out for deliberate suicide. So they have made it specific that anyone who uses a right to die law of whatever description is not described as suicide.
It's very interesting. I think it's a lovely title, VAD. Every country seems to have their own description of the law. And Marshall Perrin was chief minister of the Northern Territory and introduced this rights to the terminally ill legislation. And well, he retired. We'll talk about that to make it pass so that the people would not have to could vote their conscience. Are you still in touch with Marshall? He's now in Queensland, of course, and you're still in the Northern Territory. But
Yes, he and his wife are both still members of NTVES. You don't have to live in the territory to be a member.
you're very persistent, you Aussies. That's really good. And we're all in our 80s and still remembering the historic occasion. I remember that so vividly because in the movement, this was Bob Dent's death was monumental.
Yes.
Was there a lot of press around, a lot of publicity given to it?
I had to ask the commissioner of police to provide police protection for his funeral.
Huh.
And they sent Constable, who is now Sergeant Constable, by the way. He's been promoted. But the press was persistent, annoying. I think they tried by sending female reporters. They thought I would be more likely to talk to them, but no. The gate to my premises is always locked.
Still.
So they could not walk in.
Were you in danger, Judy?
I don't think so. But when I told the ABCs to people to go away, what I actually said was, I'm not talking to anybody. Philip Nitschke and Marshall Perrin are having a press release tomorrow at this hotel at this time. Go and talk to them.
Judy, I was just noting, of course, that you don't have an Australian accent because if I recall correctly, you're Canadian, or you were. Is that right?
I am both Canadian and Australian,
Yes.
British born, so I'm a tri-national. So I could not be in Parliament in Australia. You cannot be
Foreign.
multinational. You have to be Australian only.
Oh, interesting. I'm sorry about that. But what do you think about the progress of aid in dying in Canada?
Not enough for me to move back to Canada to die. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a little cold there, yes.
Yes, but I think it's doing reasonably well. I was astounded by the whole procedure of how Quebec got it in the first place.
Which
I
is
spoke to the woman at the conference, and it was even stranger that it should be Quebec that was first, because
yes.
Quebec is the most Catholic part of Canada. You would expect from their reputation everywhere else that they would not have allowed it in the province of Quebec.
But they've been the most forward.
The rest of the country.
Right. Right. So to just cut this a little bit short, our next World Federation of Right to Die meetings will be in Canada.
Do you know which city yet?
I don't know. I'm hoping Quebec, actually. I mean, which
Would be
state?
nice.
Yes.
It's been a long time since I've been in Quebec.
But, I mean, Victoria would be fine too. But I just want to say now, by the way, that you can now join the World Federation of Right to Die societies as an individual member. So for those of us in the audience who've been hearing about what wonderful friendships we've made through the years through that medium, you can look it up and join. So Judy, I'll look forward to seeing you next year in wherever in Canada the meeting is. And
fingers crossed.
well,
we
yeah.
cannot fly out of Australia to anywhere at the moment.
That's right. That's right. Well, yes, I'll keep my fingers crossed, but I will look forward to seeing you. And I do want to thank you for this time and this recollection about this historic moment when your husband, Bob Dent, died under the first law in the world. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Next. Next.
There are no questions in the chat. Does anyone have a question?
This is a poster for the 20th anniversary of Bob Dent's death, Bob Dent Day in Australia. Next. So in 2017, the first state to pass a law was Victoria. That was 22 years after Roe passed. And it was thanks in large part to the pioneering work of Dr. Rodney Syme. It's based on the Oregon model, which he'll talk about. But the person can be 6 to 12 months away from dying. And if she cannot swallow, can get an injection. And Rodney is the former president of Dying with Dignity Victoria. We're going to have a long interview with him now. I hope you'll sit through it. It's very important what he says, I think, for where we go in the movement. It's long, but if you do have any questions in the middle of it, we can maybe interrupt, and he won't answer, but we can answer. So next, Rodney. Oh, by the way, yeah, he was a practicing urologist in Melbourne, and he was the first doctor to become head of the Death with Dignity Victoria organization. He retired a few years ago to care for his wife who had Alzheimer's and who died recently. At the beginning of the interview, he's going to talk a little bit about it. It may not be clear, but she apparently died last Friday. He was awarded the AM, the Member of the Order of Australia. And if you remember that Australia is still part of the Commonwealth. So Victoria law went into effect in 2018 and was the first state. He wrote a book called A Good Death and a recent book called A Time to Die. Next. Rod, how have you been?
Well, I've been through a little bit of a tough time this last year or so. My wife, Meg, has had dementia,
I know.
and I've been a full-time carer for her. I moved out of Melbourne to live next to my daughter in regional Victoria so I could get some help,
Yeah.
wonderful help from her. But as you know, it just progresses as a terrible illness and it's hard work. But
Uh,
a week ago today, she died.
she
Uh,
died.
yeah,
Oh, I didn't know that.
no, well, it was getting to a stage as it does with terminal dementia where you need to make, she was confined to bed, doubly incontinent. And my family were all there. My daughter came down from Brisbane.
Hmm.
And, but the, the care that we had to provide was a violation to her, and we reached a conclusion that it was time not to prolong that. And she actually said to me um on last Friday, she said, "I'm ready." And as a result of that, it gave me the permission, if you like, and the peace to give her good sedation. And she died peacefully with all the family around her, so it couldn't have been better in that respect.
I'm glad to hear that because you cared for her for several years now. You retired,
Yes, that's right.
didn't you? Yeah.
Mm. So I think I've done the dementia journey, and it is quite a journey. And I'm very much committed now. We in Victoria have got this legislation for people who are competent. But my aim now is to proceed with argument for providing a similar right to people with dementia who have got
Oh, thank goodness.
competence.
Yes. Excuse me. I see that Australia's in pretty good hands, that Western Australia just went into effect
That's right. Yes,
today.
yes.
Yeah.
We're making some real progress here, and it's largely because we passed a law in Victoria, um, 2017. Now it's 4 years ago, um, but it was a hard battle. It's very interesting, actually. You asked in one of your notes, had we anything to do with Good Gentle Australia, and we certainly did. They were essentially very, very important in us getting that legislation up. You know, Drew Denton, who was the principal lead there, a wonderful bloke.
Yes. We'll be
Uh,
hearing from him later in the show. Yes.
yeah, we debated whether we would go for the best possible legislation or we would try and achieve legislation no matter whether it had defects or not. And we've decided it was better to get 80% of something than 100% of nothing. And so the legislation we accepted from put forward by the government was not ideal, but we supported it to the hilt. We said we're not going to argue about this and that little aspect. We want legislation. And what they did was to break the ice, as it were.
It was
Even
22 years
then,
since the first.
that's right. It was a long time coming, and there were a lot of bills in Australia which went down, private members' bills, almost all of them. This was the first government-initiated
Hmm.
legislation, and it had the power of government and drafting behind it, and a very, very good process leading into it. They had a parliamentary committee of inquiry. They set up a committee to draft the legislation. And then a committee for implementation. But even so, with all that help from government, it passed in our upper house by only 2 votes.
Oh my gosh.
So it was a close run thing. But what has happened since then, that legislation demonstrated, I think, to politicians around Australia that it was possible to pass legislation. It was possible for politicians to support legislation without getting hammered in the community. It gave them the confidence to say, yes, we can do this. And so every bill that has been passed since then, Western Australia, Tasmania, South Australia, the support in the parliament has increased every time. And the last legislation in South Australia was passed by 33 votes to 8 against. So it's now, I think we can confidently predict that Queensland will pass legislation in September, and that will leave one state, New South Wales, to get across the line. So it's a long journey, but it's in momentum.
What do you think? You think the Northern Territory will ever get a bill back?
Oh yes,
They
will. There's movements in the parliament for the territories. We have 2 territories, for them to regain the right to debate and pass their own legislation. And I'm very confident that after the 6 states all have active legislation, that the federal parliament will be unable to resist the effort to give the territories the same rights that the rest of Australia has. And the interesting thing is, Faye, that each time the Victorian legislation, as you point out, was far from ideal. It followed Oregon to a significant extent. I think the parliamentarians thought, well, there's a model that's working, it's accepted, we'll follow that reasonably closely. But with each legislation, one of the advantages of having state legislation rather than federal legislation is that each time it came up for debate, improvements could be made in the legislation. And that has happened each time a state has passed legislation. It's been better than the previous one. And the legislation that will be debated in Queensland will be very, very good, except for one thing, in my opinion, and that is it will continue with this ridiculous prognostication criterion. That is to say, all the states today that you've had to be 6 months before you would die. That's ridiculous. It is for doctors not really possible to make that decision accurately, and besides which it discriminates very, very severely against or at least 20% of people who have very severe suffering but can't meet that criteria. They're not terminally ill, they don't have a progressive illness. Somebody with a severe stroke, for example, in aged care who can't talk, can't move, paralyzed, incontinent, they can go on like that for a long time. And they surely have terrible suffering.
So in some states, it's 12 months if you have a neurodegenerative disease. Does that mean dementia? Does that mean a stroke? What does that mean?
No. The reason why dementia was excluded specifically in the Victorian legislation, simply because at the end stage of dementia, you don't have mental capacity. You lose capacity along the way, obviously. And of course, and I think rightly, it was indicated that a person had to have mental capacity to make the decision, a voluntary decision. And so they specifically excluded dementia. They wouldn't need to, because somebody with dementia with only 6 months to live would clearly not have capacity to make a decision. But we are going to follow the path of argument that has been successful in the Netherlands and in Canada, whereby a person with dementia who has capacity, that is in the early stages of the disease, but clearly has a terminal illness, could be able to make a decision to access voluntary assisted dying. That has happened in the Netherlands
Yes.
because the doctors there might regard that person as having intolerable suffering, unbearable suffering. And I would agree with that. A person like myself who lives fundamentally through my intellect, for me to lose that would be intolerable suffering. That wouldn't be to everybody, but for me, I would just hate to go on the journey that my wife has just been on. It would be for me not to have purpose in my life, to be able to do things to help other people, and that would be intolerable for me. The other thing that we want to create is for people, while before they have lost capacity but have a clear diagnosis of dementia, to be able to make an advanced care directive, which indicates that if they reach a certain stage, a certain defined stage of their dementia, that they want to have access to euthanasia. It wouldn't be, in a sense, voluntary at that point because they can't make a voluntary decision, but it would be based on their voluntary decision whilst they were competent. And this too, I think, has happened in the Netherlands, and I think it is part of the recent Canadian amendments. So that's what we're now planning to do in Victoria. We've got legislation. It's not perfect. Our first approach will be to improve the unsatisfactory things in that legislation. One of the good things in our act was that the legislation would come up for review after 5 years or during the fourth year. And then there would be opportunity for amendments. Having studied what was happening, the possibility for amendments would come up. And we're going to be planning, we are planning right now, we're developing a policy to raise the issue of dementia really after that review of the current legislation. It's a long-term project, I think, to persuade the public and the politicians to gain permission for people with dementia is a difficult task, but we will get there, and it takes time, and so we're planning for it right now.
Excellent. I'm so glad to hear that. Are you still going to have the 6 to 12 months terminal requirement, or are you going to try to change that?
Well, that's what we're going to attack.
That would,
The Queensland legislation has, which is drafted and is before the Parliament, extends the 6 months to 12 months
yes.
for all persons. I would like to see that prognostication completely eliminated. We will be arguing for that because there are very, very sound arguments that it makes no sense. I understand that in Oregon, the only reason 6 months was chosen because that was the point at which people gained financial help for hospice.
Yeah, it has no relationship to the issue, though.
Yeah, no relationship to the issue at all. So we're going to attack that very strongly. We're developing arguments, collecting all sorts of data and information on that. So we'll be having a red hot getting that eliminated. The original Victorian legislation actually was seeking for a 12-month prognostication rather than 6, but it got amended during the parliamentary debate. So there is a appetite to extend that, and we would have to remove it altogether.
And also, Rodney, it's possible then to get an injection if you're no longer able to swallow the medication. Is that correct?
That's right.
Is it now correct in Victoria? Or
Yes.
will it be correct?
That is correct. That was it was a contested matter. I personally, I've helped over 300 people with medication. and I have never had to give anybody a lethal injection.
We don't
It
have
is quite
Nembutal in our
remarkable.
country anymore, you know. We don't have Nembutal in our country anymore. I certainly would agree with you if it was a one-shot deal, but we don't have it. We now have a combination of different drugs.
Yeah, well, that's a shame
It is.
because I often make the analogy that if you list there's a lot of drugs you can take to end your life, and I make the analogy if you pull on the starting line of a 100-meter race, and Nembutal was out there in lane 8, would win the race by 20 meters. It's that much better than any other possible medication that you could use.
Everybody,
I've never seen any serious complications. Sure, a few people they have a little regurgitation perhaps at the taste of it, but complications no. The right dose with the right preparation of antiemetic and support and giving people. I spend a lot of time giving people confidence that it will work. I always advise that somebody be with them, preferably members of the family. And it's always the case when members of the family are present, they just are so amazed at the peacefulness and dignity of the process and so thankful, basically. It's just a wonderful thing to see and be part of.
Rodney, you were very courageous as a doctor, and I want to particularly talk to you because you're a model for doctors. Doctors don't generally do anything as courageous as you've done over the many years. I remember back, I think in 1996, when you developed this Melbourne 12, am I right about that? Or Melbourne 10 statement that doctors, these 10 doctors that signed the document, all helped their patients die?
That's right. That was at the 1996 World Federation meeting.
Yes.
Actually, actually, that wonderful British doctor, I'm all for names, you know who I mean. Michael Irwin, yeah.
Yeah.
Michael Irwin gathered together a meeting of all the doctors attending that, and we issued a manifesto validating that doctors have every reason to be involved with this. It was interesting that not long after that, or actually at that time, Marshall Perrins legislation had passed.
That's right.
And I had a very interesting experience with a British journalist who came out to write about it, an independent journalist. And he interviewed me, and he suggested that, or I suggested, or maybe I could make a statement about helping people. And he said, "Look, you want to be very careful. If you do that on your own, you'll be a target and you'll get taken down." He said, with this sort of coming out, as it were, if you do it as a group, a body of doctors, then you will have protection. So we formed what was known as the Melbourne 7. And we got seven doctors who altogether came out and said, yes, we had helped patients to die. And that was my first experience, not quite, almost my first experience with the police authorities. I got a phone call after we'd made that admission on the front page of a major newspaper. And they said, "Doctor, you've made this comment." Policeman said, "Is there anything else you want to say?" And I said, "No, I have nothing else to say." And they said, "Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the matter." So, of course, that was logical because there were no names, no practical, so there wasn't really very much that the authorities could do. But it gave me a certain amount of confidence. And well, my medical board took no action against me over that. So it was my first little bit of confidence that maybe the authorities got an attitude towards this that it wasn't quite as aggressive that I might have thought. In 1992, I joined Dying with Dignity Victoria. Jack Kevorkian had come out to Australia in the late 1980s.
Did he?
And I had met and talked with him, and I wrote a paper in the Medical Journal of Australia extolling his attitudes. And from that point, I was the only doctor who had ever been on the board of Dying with Dignity Victoria. So I became the recipient of all the phone calls from people, the public, our members, who wanted advice about end of life. And so I gradually sort of got drawn deeper and deeper and deeper into counseling people and eventually helping people. And I guess the real critical thing for me came with Steve Guest, who was a man with esophageal cancer and had a peg tube. And he had gone on national radio requesting the right to end his life, weighing into the Catholic Church for its attitudes in preventing him. And he rang me and he asked me, could I help him? And I drove down to his house at about 90 kilometers away and interviewed him. And on the way down, I thought, this could be the circumstances for a legal challenge. Because here was somebody who'd been on national television, he'd aired the matter, and he had every good reason. He was wasted away despite his tube feeding. And so I decided after interviewing him that I would provide him with Nembutal. And having done that, I said, look, I'll give you the medication. It's not dependent on anything further from you. But if you would like to, you could become a very important person in this debate. He had an offer to go back onto Radio National. I put him in touch with 4 or 5 journalists. The matter just became red hot. Klonitsky was also involved at that time. And he died, having taken the Nembutal. I wasn't present when he died. He was also took part in a major film that had been produced by one of our stations. And I thought, here's all the criteria you need to make a challenge to the law. There was one of your, I think, the greatest American president, Abraham Lincoln, who said something to the effect, and I'm just paraphrasing what he said, but he said, law cannot be sustained unless it is supported by the people. Very profound. And I knew from the research on public attitudes that the public was highly supportive of a change to the law in Victoria. And it's just got stronger and stronger and stronger. It's now 80 to 85%. That time it was around 75%. But I thought, here's an issue the public supports. I think this will be a good platform for attacking bad law. And so I gradually, over the next 3 or 4 years, every opportunity I had on radio, on television, I would just slowly unfold to a greater extent my involvement with Steve Guest, without actually saying that I'd given him Nembutal. But I made it bloody clear. Anybody with a half a brain would know that that was what I had done. And the authorities, the police, interviewed me at least twice, and but I got formed the opinion as they interviewed me that they were going through a process. They weren't really particularly. In fact, I had evidence from talking with some of the police that they really weren't interested in pursuing the matter. So I formed the view that there was a silent conspiracy. The police, the coroner's office, the director of public prosecutions, the attorney general, that really weren't interested in going after a doctor like myself. And I think the reason was that I think they thought they would lose a case. If they prosecuted me, there was every probability that a jury would say, no, this is a good doctor. He's not a criminal. But anyway, that was what I was thinking. Eventually, in 2015, after a great deal of thought and careful preparation, unlike Jack Kevorkian, who I was a great admirer of, but Jack did a very silly thing when he went on television and was and quite visually ended somebody's life. It was a bit provocative, wasn't it? So I
No.
wasn't going to do that, but I carefully prepared the way, and so in 2015 I publicly stated that I had given Steve Guest an Nembutal. The police interviewed me again. I'll never forget. The police sergeant said to me in the interview, he said, "You want to be prosecuted, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do. If that's what's necessary, I will be prosecuted." And he said, "Oh, that's not going to happen." He said, "There's not enough evidence." So that's how it evolved. It wasn't, I was very careful, I can tell you. I didn't take undue risks. I prepared the way, established the argument, and in the end, the argument won. And I think
Rodney,
that
you consistently provoked the police. You called them and said you
absolutely,
committed euthanasia and it was terminal sedation. You did a lot of things along the way before Steve Guest, I think, and you got away with it all.
that's right.
And I
Well, I challenged,
want other doctors to know what you did because doctors are pretty timid, as are politicians. And all this
that's right.
time, you were so provocative, and you accomplished what you accomplished, and that is
Yes,
enable other doctors to do this. I thought it was remarkable.
that's right. Yeah. Well, I got a leg up with terminal sedation because I had one of my patients with prostate cancer who was terminally sedated. Took about a week. Um, I'd never heard of it before, and I then went and looked up all the literature. His death was not reported to the coroner. There was no inquiry, and I thought, how can that be? He's been drugged to death by the medical profession. They're not reporting it to the coroner. That's not a natural death. And so I thought, oh, well, this is an avenue we can have a go at. I did provide terminal sedation myself to 3 patients. This was before I had access to Nembutal. And I reported each of those cases to the coroner in order to provoke debate about terminal sedation. To this day, doctors can end people's lives in palliative care with terminal sedation. And there is no regulation, there is no law, there is no reportage, there is no second opinion necessarily. And that strikes me as just plain ridiculous when there's all these regulations surrounding assisted dying, and palliative care people can help people to die without any regulation at all. So,
And that remains, even though you made a good case that you should be arrested for doing it. They didn't arrest you, but it goes on. The practice remains still.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, doctors, I knew doctors that were helping people to die, but they did it quietly. Doctors have helped people to die for decades, centuries, really.
Yes.
But it needed to be exposed. It needed, the hypocrisy of it all needed to be exposed. And that's frankly what I set out to do. And I think it did help to create an environment where, and I talked constantly about the silent conspiracy, just to embarrass the authorities and make them. And actually, it was very interesting because when we had the parliamentary inquiry into this, one of the most important people to speak at that was the state coroner. And the state coroner came out and said, well, look, we have got 2 people, elderly people usually, elderly people with severe, intolerable illness, cancer, and other situations who are committing suicide every week. And they're committing suicide in the most appalling circumstances. And the coroner was clearly supportive of a change to the law to try and prevent those terrible deaths. And they recognized that something could be done to help these people to have a decent death, a dignified death, rather than having to undertake a violent suicide. And that was very, very powerful evidence from a member of the conspiracy, which had a very powerful impact on the parliamentary committee's recommendation that the law be changed.
How would you advise other doctors all over the world to be more brave about advocating for this?
So I would. See, the climate has changed all over the world. You know that there's now argument going on in Scotland. They're going to have a bill. The United Kingdom is finally coming to its senses, and the Parliament is beginning to talk more realistically about it. You've got countries like Portugal and Spain who have passed legislation, you know, Catholic countries, you might say. So the tide, the momentum, the tide is all for change in this area. People want it. It's natural enough. And so I think the platform is there for doctors to say, yeah, we do this, we have been doing it, we've been doing it quietly, but it's time that this was properly regulated. But not regulated in the way Victoria has done it. Our legislation is very flawed. It's so full of bureaucracy that it takes weeks for people to go through the process. One of the reasons is that the permission for voluntary assisted dying has to be prospective. That is to say, all the paperwork, all the documentation has to be done for the health department to say, yes, you may prescribe the medication. In every other country, except I believe Colombia, it is done retrospectively. The doctor helps the patient, the two doctors involved, and then they have to practice medicine. Otherwise, they will be liable for prosecution for having misbehaved. And allows just the normal medical process to take place. The legislation in Victoria is actually insulting to the medical profession by assuming that they're going to behave badly and putting in place a whole lot of regulations to try and control them. There's no other area of medical practice in Australia which is so constrained.
Would you agree that the other three pieces of legislation are equally bureaucratic, if not more? Tasmania practically outlines every eye blink that the doctor has to take and the patient has to take. It's so complicated as compared, for example, with New Zealand, which is much more liberal. Would you agree that these each piece of legislation incorporates a new change, which is good, but then gets more and more and more bureaucratic and boasts about being the most safeguarded legislation in the world? Is that good?
I don't think they've got worse. I think they've a lot of them have, naturally enough, if a state sees that Victorian legislation has passed, then that would be not an unreasonable model to imagine that there might be success in their state. But so they haven't got worse. I don't think you could argue that. Each one has got better. For example, in Victoria, you have to have a specialist in the illness. So if you're suffering from motor neuron disease, you've got to get an assessment from a neurologist. Now, neurologists are not on the ground. And if you happen to be in Mildura, with the Victorian town, which is 600 kilometres from Melbourne, and the only neurologist who's has got the training and is willing to give an opinion is 600 kilometers away. You've got motor neurone disease. You've got to travel to Melbourne to get opinion. That wasn't the intention of the original legislation, but it was changed in the debate. Tasmania has got away with dismissed that. There's no need for specialist assessment. Specialist opinion, yes, but not a specialist assessment. They've got a lot of improvements over. For example, the Victorian legislation said a doctor could not raise the question of voluntary assisted dying with the patient. That's a contradiction of medical practice and ethics. My role as a doctor is to provide you with all the information you need to make a decision. And if a person asks me about, well, I'm dying now, what are my options? Then, of course, ethically, I should be able to say, well, in addition to palliative care and good pain relief, that voluntary assisted dying is a legal option. But that's gone by the board. No other state has included that. The Queensland legislation, as I say, will allow for a 12-month prognostic limit. And a lot of the relatively annoying little things in the Victorian legislation gradually be discarded by each new state. I think the best legislation in the world is that where there is no legislation, and that's in Switzerland. It simply says that it is not a crime to assist a person in suicide, provided it's not for gain. And that's all it is. But then the doctors have to operate properly, ethically, carefully. But it requires a doctor to provide the medication. So there is a medical assessment. This is where I have some argument with Philip Nitschke. Philip and I started out on this journey working very much together. In fact, he came to my office down in Melbourne right at the beginning of the Northern Territory legislation and asked my opinion about providing assistance or support to a woman who had just been diagnosed with colon cancer. It was curable. She didn't have any metastasis, but she, as often is the case, she got the diagnosis, she got very depressed and asked for assistance to die. And where I come apart from Philip is that he thinks there's no need for medical involvement essentially at all. My experience is quite deep, and I certainly come across people whose decision or request for assistance to die was based largely on depression. And of course, it would be a tragedy for somebody who has a treatable depression to be assisted to die. I also found people who came who had not had proper information about their illness. They thought like this woman I've just mentioned, they thought they were in desperate trouble, but they were not. There was good treatment which would be available to them. So I believe that there is a role for a doctor, not to make the decision as to whether a person has intolerable suffering, not at all, but to make a decision that the person is competent to make a decision and that they have full information, that they're fully informed about their circumstances, so that you don't get people making decisions to end their life in the belief that there's nothing more that can be done or that treatment is not available. And I've found lots of people who I would counsel, would say, yes, I understand your reason. I will give you medication, but I don't think this is the right time. I will support you. You should continue, because at that time they didn't have intolerable suffering. I said, when you begin to get suffering, that is a time when I will provide you with medication. The other thing about sort of an approach and giving people oral medication rather than promising them injection is that a remarkable thing happens when you've got somebody who is got suffering or is heading towards severe suffering. Once you gave them medication, you gave them control over the end of their life. And that, I believe, is one of the most powerful palliatives that doctors have available in treating people at the end of their life. It's an astonishing thing that if you give a person Nembutal, it has a magnificent effect, a drug which is not even taken. And as you know, in Oregon, about 30% of people who get the medication don't take it. Does that mean to say it hasn't been useful? Of course it's been useful.
Rodney, I have to disagree. I have to disagree with that. It's not just the reassurance of having it, but because there's a 15-day waiting period, a lot of those people would have taken the medication, but the waiting period is so long, they're no longer able to. So I disagree with that 30%. You know, it just worked wonders because it was in the medicine chest. That's not the reason often that that medication wasn't taken. It was
Well, I
not
agree with
taken
you.
because the person could no longer swallow and was
Yeah,
no longer mentally competent. And that
yeah.
law
Well,
has
that's
to change.
yeah. Well, that's true, and that would be uh, that's. I mean, I just totally disagree with the 15-day waiting period. We in Victoria have a 9-day waiting period. For goodness sake, you know, anybody who has had any dealings with these people know that they've been thinking about this usually for quite a long time. And after they've been through a consultation with doctors, any suggestion that they're going to change their mind and they're being put into this is absolutely nonsense. So I believe that you should be able to give them the medication. They're in such distress that they need to take it straight away, so be it. But in many, many cases, I've had people who've waited 6 months before they take it, supported by the fact that they've got the medication.
Right.
And that relieves the many people in the community think, oh, well, this is all about pain. But there's a failure to recognize the psychological and existential suffering that people have. Anybody who's facing the end of their life has got extraordinary psychological and existential distress. You know, they're worried sick as to what's going to happen. How badly are they going to die? You give them the means of dying well, dying comfortably, dying peacefully, dying with dignity, accompanied by their family, and all of that disappears. It just disappears almost instantly. You give them the medication. And so they can go towards the end of their life completely comfortable, that they're in control. If things get too tough, they've got what I call the key to the fire escape.
Well, you've just heard from Dr. Rodney Syme, who has been, I think, the leading medical pioneer in this field. Everybody in Australia knows who he is, and I would hope the rest of the world and the doctors listening to this understand what Dr. Syme has done to promote the idea of assisted dying, even at the risk of his own freedom and his own reputation. But actually, your reputation grew with the courage that you displayed in being forthright about what you've done. So thank you, Rodney. It's a pleasure to see you again. I'm sorry or glad that your wife finally died peacefully. And I'm very happy to know that you're going to be pushing for legislation in Victoria about dementia. That's really an important first step in Australia. Thank
Yes,
you.
indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much, Faye. Lovely to meet with you again.
Lovely to meet with you, Rodney. Bye. Well, that was long, but I so appreciated everything he had to say, and of course, happened to agree with it. Um, this is a group from Western Australia celebrating their law that went into effect a couple of days ago. 25 years since Roti became a law. So it takes a lot of perseverance, and we hope some of the things that Rodney just told you about will happen soon, in my opinion. Next. Last but not least is an interview with Marshall Perrin, whom we discussed earlier as the pioneer and courageous politician in the Northern Territory. It happens that we had to do this last, but you'll note that all these people are still vigorous and very much involved with our movement. So now Marshall Perrin, I hope you are still with us. Thank you. Marshall,
Sorry.
next Australia, I'll introduce you. This, everybody, is the famous Marshall Perrin, who introduced the first law that went into effect in the world, the right of the terminally ill act. Rights or right?
Rights,
Right
plural.
of the terminally ill act, ROTI, when it was introduced in 1995. So Marshall, what made you do a thing like that as you were chief minister of the Northern Territory and you introduced this suddenly? How did that happen?
Yes, I introduced it as a private member's bill, which means any member of parliament, of course, can introduce a bill on any subject they wish. It's highly unusual that a chief minister would introduce a bill because you're normally pretty busy running the government. So it was a bit unusual in that respect. However, I chose a private member's bill so that it was a sort of on neutral ground. I wasn't embarrassing my colleagues in my political party by trying to coerce them into supporting the bill in block. I was to have every individual exercise their conscience on what I was proposing. But the reason behind it is not dramatic as the media would always want it. They wanted some dramatic event that had affected me so profoundly that I decided to take this unusual step, which hadn't been taken before by any other parliament, to our knowledge. I had simply always believed, for as long as I could remember, that a person who was suffering terribly and near death ought to be able to ask for it to be their death to be advanced, just to relieve the balance of their suffering. It was just a belief I had probably all my life and not for any particular reason. So the catalyst for me to actually do something after I'd been in Parliament for 21 years was a conference held by the Australian Medical Association, of all people, subsequently to be my arch enemies on this subject. But they held a conference on death, dying, and the law in Canberra. And I read about the conference being held, and I asked my office to send for the papers that were presented by each of the speakers. And they sat on my desk for a couple of months when they did come, because obviously I was pretty busy being chief minister. And eventually I got around to reading these papers, and one of them in particular by a marvelous woman named Helga Kuser, Dr. Helga Kuser, who you may know, Faye, in fact, from
Yeah.
Victoria. Her paper supporting voluntary euthanasia was for competent adults was so profoundly logical that I finished reading the paper and put it down and said to myself, I'm going to introduce a law on this. I had no idea that I would be successful, but I thought that if I did try and failed, I may advance the day when someone else picked up the issue and carried it forward, be they in the Northern Territory or elsewhere. So to me, there was no downside to me raising this issue that hadn't been raised before. I had no idea at the time of what a cat among the pigeons I'd just started when I announced what I was going to do. There was extraordinary levels of interest, most of it support, not only from my constituents in the Northern Territory, but across Australia. I was inundated, and subsequently my colleagues were as well in Parliament, just inundated. Thousands of letters and submissions and phone calls, just crying out to be heard. I put it down, the phenomena was a bit like I'd scratched society and it had started to bleed. These people had had these stories bottled up inside them all of their lives about some family member or close friend who had died in horrific circumstances, and in some cases where the family had actually intervened. Uh, and they were held it bottled up inside all of these years, and finally they found there it seemed that someone understood, and they could let it come out. And yeah, it was an amazing experience, that period prior to the legislation actually passing.
Marshall, you said there was no downside. What about politically?
Well, I'd been in Parliament 21 years, and if my constituents had got upset with me and said this is a grossly irresponsible thing to do and you should never have done it, and we'll throw you out at the next election, I would have said, well, so be it. It's been great. It was great while it lasted. I never had to be a politician. I was there almost by accident initially. I did the job as best I could while I was there. But if at any time something had occurred that I'd no longer been a politician, it would not have greatly bothered me. There were other things in life I wanted to get on and do.
So you resigned before the vote was taken, if I recall.
Yes, the bill had been before the House for 3 months for the period of public consultation. And just leading up to the vote, there was a rumour sort of started in the community that some people in the Parliament may vote for the legislation because I was Chief Minister and they wanted, sort of to support me. Or some people may vote against the legislation because I was Chief Minister because they were part of the opposition, for example, and would do anything to avoid me scoring a point, as it were. So I thought there's only one solution to this. It's an instant solution and it's a complete solution. Solves the problem absolutely. And that is just prior to the vote. In fact, I think it was about 24 hours before the vote was to be taken, I announced that I would resign as Chief Minister and a Member of Parliament the following Monday. And that put the issue to bed totally, that the vote would be carried out with every Member of Parliament voting as they did because that's how they felt, not because of the way someone else was going to vote. And that's what I wanted, a true conscience vote.
It squeaked through, is that right?
It did. There's 3 votes in Parliament, the first, second and third reading in our Parliament, of course, for a law to pass. The second reading vote is the crucial one to get it into committee to consider the detail. And that passed 13 to 12. So that's about as close a vote as you could get. After the bill had gone through committee, it had been amended quite a number of times and improved, and in some respects not so improved, I guess, with the detail. But it then passed 15 to 12 and the final vote.
And then it went into effect, and it was so complicated, as I remember, that nobody could die under it.
Yes, no, it wasn't the complication that made it difficult to use, because it was opposed by the AMA so strongly and a group of churches in the Northern Territory. The entire campaign, of course, was run, the anti-campaign by them, quite savagely and quite dishonestly. They were so determined to stop it, of course, because it was the first time it had ever happened. And it was desperate for them to stop this process, which they believed was wrong. And the AMA told doctors in the Northern Territory that if they acted under the law while there was a legal challenge to the law, which there was, and the law was found to be invalid, that they could be prosecuted. Now that's completely nonsensical. I mean, if a doctor acted under a law which everyone believed was valid, while the court case was considering that very question, and it was subsequently found to be invalid, well then you haven't broken a law that it was been found to be invalid, as it were. Anyway, doctors are a conservative lot. No one really wanted to be the first people to into the fray, as it were, apart from a most extraordinary individual, Dr. Philip Nitsky, who was prepared to come right out front. So the reason why Philip had so much difficulty getting a second doctor to assess the first patients that came forward In fact, doctors just refused en masse to even see the patients. All they had to do was verify their condition as being terminal or not. They were not asked to do anything else, the second doctor, but they absolutely refused, and it created a great deal of angst and publicity at the time. And yeah, the tragic stories about that. And on one stage, a woman with a terrible disease went on television to appeal for a second doctor to come forward because Philip had run out of all of the options and all of the people he could approach, and was refused at every front. However, this woman's appearance on TV was moved a particular specialist in Darwin to the point where he could not hold his conscience back, and he saw her and approved her, and that sort of broke the ice, as it were. And 4 people used the legislation to die in the 9-month period that it stayed on foot before it was overturned. But the law itself wasn't unnecessarily complicated, less complicated than laws passed today, with the exception that it did require a compulsory psychiatric examination, which was an amendment to my original legislation, which I would have opposed vehemently. But the law was amended after I'd left Parliament.
That lady that you mentioned must have died after Bob Dent.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Bob was the first person to die, and Janet was, I'm pretty sure, the second of the 4. And my heart goes out every time I think of it to Janet in particular, because I saw her physically on TV, as so many people did, and her condition was just so awful. Whereas Bob obviously met all the requirements, but I hadn't seen him or met him prior to his using the legislation.
Did you ever meet him?
No, I didn't meet Bob. I met the first guy, Max Bell, who
Oh,
actually tried to use the law. He would have been eligible. He had advanced cancer. He was the man who drove a taxi 2,000 miles
Broken Hill.
to Darwin. And when no one would see him, Philip tried his best, but no doctor would see him. Max ended up getting in his car and driving 2,000 miles back and dying horribly in Broken Hill. I had met Max because he asked Philip, would I go and see him? Max was in Darwin Hospital at the time, and he just wanted to abuse Philip and me, which he did, for not doing our homework, for having set up this law, and Philip, of course, willing to use it. And no, despite any efforts by either of us, no one would help Max. And so he was left to go away. He would obviously have been eligible. And so he was the first person to come forward to use the law, even before Bob Dent, but he was denied it, whereas Bob got through as the first at the
And
end
it
of it.
wasn't a residence matter, because even though Max Bell lived in Broken Hill, he would still have been eligible.
Yes, we didn't have a residential requirement in the Northern Territory. And in hindsight, and the reason we didn't have a residential requirement was, I remember discussing this with the leader of the opposition in our parliament, who was a supporter. We felt that the motivation for these laws is compassion. And if it is compassion, why would a patient who happened to be in the Northern Territory, having suffered an accident or a stroke, or well, perhaps not a stroke, but found themselves eligible and dying in the Northern Territory in one bed, and a Territorian alongside them, one eligible for voluntary euthanasia and one not? It made no sense. So we didn't put an eligibility requirement that people had to be residents of the Northern Territory. I think in hindsight, that was politically probably a mistake. That gave the politicians in Canberra, the religious zealots who overturned it at the end of the day, the capacity to say that the Northern Territory had effectively legislated for the whole of Australia. I mean, they could have said we legislated for the whole of the world for that matter, but we couldn't deny that people could visit the Northern Territory. And in fact, 2 of the 4 people who died using the legislation were from interstate.
All right. So overturning the law must have been a shock to you. Was it a surprise, or were you expecting them to make it a void letter, a law?
It was a shock for this reason, Faye. The law had suffered, had survived 2 challenges. The first was a legal challenge to its validity as soon as it was passed. The opponents challenged it that the Northern Territory Parliament didn't have the constitutional standing to pass the law. The courts ruled that it was valid, and then there was an appeal put forward to that decision. So while that was happening, another appeal was made to the Prime Minister of Australia, who had the power to overturn any law of the Northern Territory within 6 months of its passage through Parliament. He had to refer it to the Governor-General of Australia, but the law provided that they could do that as an administrative procedure. Now, the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, Paul Keating, a man who I haven't agreed with very much, to his credit, rejected the approach to overturn the Territory's legislation on the basis that this was a matter for Territorians, not for Canberra interference. So the Roti had survived those 2 very serious high-level constitutional challenges to its standing. And I thought nothing could happen to interfere with it from that point on. Unbelievably, a private member's bill in federal parliament, something that is very rare, and even when they are introduced, even rarer that one would ever get passed through federal parliament, because it's interfering with government business to address such legislation put forward by any member of parliament. But for a private member's bill to get up and debated, even set aside federal government business was set aside day after day in order that the Euthanasia Laws Act could be debated to overturn the Territory's law. It shows the high level of support from the Prime Minister, John Howard, to the sponsor, Kevin Andrews, who's still there in federal parliament, unfortunately, and a man called Tony Burke, who was the Labor side of the Catholic clique that overturned the legislation at the end of the day.
Actually, Marshall, Judy told me that Kevin Andrews had lost his seat in Parliament. You know about
No, he's lost endorsement.
Oh.
He is actually the longest serving federal member of parliament, I believe, at this stage. And it is certainly time he got out. But his political party has denied him endorsement for the next federal election to be held sometime in the next several months to a year. So he won't be in parliament after that point.
So 22 years later, finally, the first state in Australia passed a law, Victoria 2017. And now we have 4 states looking for 2 more. What do you think the prospects of the next 2 and also the territories will be?
Well, the first of those 2 states will be Queensland, where I'm a resident, I'm pleased to say. Its vote will be coming up in September this year. And on current indications, the law should survive and pass Parliament. The campaign is on now in earnest. Both the pro and antis are in full flight. We are all in full flight and convincing our politicians that this is what the community wants. It's a very good law that Queensland has introduced, the draft law. It has taken advantage of experience in Victoria and improvements made in Western Australia, and Tasmania, and they've made an even better law. So we're really hoping and are hopeful that Queensland will be the fifth state. The last one will be New South Wales, Australia's biggest state. Virtually 1/3 of the Australian population live in New South Wales. And it will be a tough nut to crack. There are religious forces at high levels of both sides of politics in New South Wales are very strong. And that's why it's going to be the last state to fall. I'm not sure when, but I predict that it will. As far as the territories are concerned, both territories are still denied the capacity to debate the law in their parliament or pass it. And there is a move now by one of the senators in the Northern Territory to introduce legislation to overturn that federal ban. And there's a suggestion that that bill could be debated this coming August in federal parliament. It will be most interesting to see how that fares, because the issue is actually one about democracy, not about voluntary euthanasia. The issue is, should the 600,000 Australians who happen to live in the territories be denied the capacity to have parliaments decide this issue on their behalf, like the other 23 million Australians can? So it's about democracy, and then it will then be up to the territories' parliaments to decide whether or not to proceed. And I suspect both will if they get the opportunity.
When you wrote the Roti law, there was no 6-month terminal ill, 12-month requirement, which there now is. Do you expect that to continue in the Queensland, New South Wales, and territorial legislation in the future?
Well, Queensland, I'm pleased to say, has dropped the 6-month time period that it predicted to death of an applicant, and kept the 12 months, which was originally put in Victoria's law for motor neuro people with
Neurodegenerative disease. Yeah.
neurodegenerative conditions. So anyway, 12 months to death is the Queensland requirement. You're right, the Northern Territory had no requirement at all, and that's what I believe should be the case. If you're terminally ill, you're terminally ill. And my plan in my legislation was, as soon as you were diagnosed as terminal, you could basically determine whether you would be eligible if life got bad enough for assistance to die. And once you were found to be eligible, you could then get on with extending your life for as long as you can, for as long as life was bearable. So the whole plan was to get the assessment out of the way and get on with living. We're now, by putting time limits on how long you are predicted to live before you're eligible for assistance, we're sort of putting targets in front of people where they have to get to a degenerative point where they can even find out whether they're going to be eligible. So to me, it's still somewhat unfair. Legislators in this respect, and this is a good example, have approached this law, all of them in Australia, and I gather in the US as well, reluctantly. They've approached the law on the basis, how can we draw up conditions where as few people as possible will be eligible? Right. And that's completely the wrong approach. Completely the wrong approach. The most successful law will be the one where the most people are eligible with the least fuss in order to determine eligibility. And of course, my preference would be not even to have terminal illness as a requirement, even though I had it in the Northern Territory, bearing in mind we were the first in the world. There weren't any other models to go by. And I'm not sorry that we limited it to competent terminally ill adults at that time 25 years ago. But today, we ought to drop terminal and follow the European system where it's suffering is the determination of whether you want to continue to live, not whether the disease is going to kill you or not.
The other thing that was fairly easy in Roti was that a lethal injection was par for the course. That's what Bob Dent got. He requested it, I'm assuming.
Sorry, who requested it?
Bob Dent.
Oh, Bob Dent. Yes, yes, indeed, he did. Yes, our law allowed either the doctor or the patient to administer. It was a matter to be determined between the two of them. And in what Philip did with the 4 patients that he assisted to die, Bob Dent being the first, was to set up an intravenous line with a syringe driver. And of course, each of those individuals actually took their own life by activating the syringe driver. However, they needed the medical assistance, of course, for the intravenous strips. And I believe that in the future, that will become probably a preferred method of deliverance in the Australian system. It shows, it alleviates the doctor from physically directly assisting, they're assisting the patient to die, but they're not doing it themselves. The patient is doing it. But it is a very effective way because it's intravenous, and it avoids the problems of taking medicine orally, which I still have trouble comprehending that the Oregon situation remains today in that it has to be oral, no other. Just extraordinary.
It is, yeah. We keep passing the same law. We have it in 10 states, and if we have it, it's going to be the same exact law that was passed.
Well, there's an example of how the politicians are approaching this in a begrudging, miserable way, in a reluctant way, and that is that they're all following the leader in the US as a good example with the most conservative legislation. They're not opening it up at all based on the principles of what are you really trying to do here? Relieve suffering. So we've got a fair way to go on this in this cause yet.
Well, that was the next question. And your assessment of right to die around the world, where do you think we are with it?
Well, the Europeans are obviously the most sophisticated, if I can use that term, the most compassionate and the most understanding of the issues.
I think that's a little misleading because we don't have a law in England, France, Italy. We need to now have in Spain, but so not all Europeans, I guess.
I'm sorry, when I said Europe, I was actually referring to those European jurisdictions that actually have, that is Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, and of course Switzerland is a great model of saying, well, there's an example where society has not collapsed and it has the most liberal regime in the world and has had it for 50 years or more. And so if society was ever going to collapse, which is what our opponents predict, as you know, it would have long ago happened in Switzerland. However, yeah, I think we've got in the US situation, and certainly in Australia, New Zealand, we're at the very leading edge of where we should be. I'm hoping that as experience is further gained with these laws in operation, for example, in Victoria, Western Australia coming on stream and only a couple of days ago, that legislators will be more willing to amend these laws in the future in the light of actual experience and in the light of the pressure which will come from those people who are still missing out, who ought to be eligible but are not under the laws. So I think the laws will be eased in time. I wouldn't put a time limit on it, but they will be eased because it's the compassionate thing to do.
Marshall, I am very proud that you're on our show today. I thought what you did in 1995 was so courageous. I rarely meet a courageous politician. I rarely ever even knew one. And for you to do what you did and then resign as chief minister, I thought was excellent and pioneering. Have you ever talked to Helga Cusa about the fact that you were inspired by her paper?
Yes, I have. I'm pleased to say I've met Helga a couple of times, many years ago, sadly. But yeah, I was so impressed with her as a person, as well as her paper, of course. Just such profound logic, no other way to describe it. And she knows that she was the catalyst for me to do what I did. She showed me how, basically, and convinced me that it was a right course just by reading her paper before I'd ever met her. But yeah, she was, I think, justly, quietly proud that her paper had had such an effect.
Well, and to take it up by a politician is remarkable. She was professor of philosophy at Monash University in Victoria, wasn't she?
Yes, yes, yes.
Anyway, thank you, Marshall, for being here today and for your whole career and helping what has become a very civil law in Australia. I think much better law than when it started out. Not when it started out, not when you introduced it, but a better law than it was first law in Victoria. And I really appreciate that you're still involved in this cause and doing good work. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity, Faye, and all best wishes to you.
Well, that was the famous Marshall Perrin. I'm so awed at the wisdom that some of these people have. So here's a poster that appeared in Canberra. One thing Canberrans definitely don't need is assisted thinking. And of course, Canberra is the capital of ACT, the capital territory. The federal government must let Canberrans make their own laws about assisted dying. Next. This is Andrew Denton, who is the current leader of the Australian Right to Die movement, a very decent as a bloke, I guess. And we don't have time, unfortunately, to hear from him today, but there's such good leadership in Australia that it's very encouraging to know is going to go on. Next. So to summarize, I think I don't need to do this actually, but what I want to say is I had asked Marshall and Rodney to cover the laws in those 4 states because they're too complicated. I couldn't have done it on this show. And they did that. And some points that they made are summarized in the next slide, but the complete text of their response to my request can be found at the end of this presentation, which will be on the Hemlock website, hemlocksocietysandiego.org. Next. I'm just going to briefly, these are highlights from their summaries that I thought were very interesting, and especially because they so much pertain to where we are in America. I'll just read a few paragraphs. All Australian laws so far are limited to competent terminally ill adults predicted to die within 6 or 12 months. Personally, Marshall says, I would like to see the time period shortened, abolished, and secondly, the requirement that the illness be terminal should also be dropped. Ideally, eligibility should be limited to incurable, unbearable suffering. Jump, he says, I am hopeful that when more experience is gained, state parliaments will be prepared to amend the laws to make them more efficient and compassionate. And then Rodney says, Victoria adopted a very conservative approach, modeling on Oregon, which was functioning at that time well without abuse. This compared with Benelux laws, which had a fundamental entry criterion of unbearable suffering, aided predominantly by lethal injection. And of course, we'll talk about the Benelux laws later in these sessions. Oregon had 2 major characteristics of difference, namely oral administration only and terminal illness within 6 months to live. And then I'm going to jump, Rodney also says, the principal problems with all Australian acts are 1, the prognostication issue. related, 6 months, and restriction to terminal illness. And 2, the perspective needed for permission to prescribe. Overarching problems, which we haven't talked about today very much, are the exclusion of persons with psychiatric illness, minors, and persons with dementia. And of course, these are included in the Benelux laws, which we'll discuss later. Next, the next 4 slides are the, So yeah, I'd wanted to tell you to keep your eye on what's going on in Australia, because as you can see, the really tough nuts are yet to crack, the 2 states and the 2 territories. So watch what's going on there. I think there'll be fireworks. Next. Number 3 in our Peaceful Death series will be July 22nd, which looks at assisted dying in the United States, which we'll look at Jack Kevorkian and Derek Humphrey, the Final Exit Network, and of course the current law that we're now in 10 states, and our website, hemlocksocietysandiego.org. Next. These 4 pages are the appendices based on the writings of Marshall and Rodney, because it was too difficult to go into those 4 states, but they all have different provisions, and I thought you might like to see them. Next. And you can see it's very detailed. I did highlight the parts that I thought were interesting. Next. Next. So you get really the specifics of the law, the subtleties. Next. So that's it. So there's 4 pages of specifics about these 4 states that I think you might be interested in. And with that, I thank you very much for coming. I hope you're all still awake. I hope you've all learned something today, and I hope you'll join us 2 weeks from now to learn about the United States of America.